Hello, Professor Laird here, and this is Chapter 5 of the American Government course, talking about Congress, which is the lawmaking branch of government. We are currently in the 118th Congress, which new Congress gets elected every 2 years. We'll get into that here in a few minutes. First of all, let's look at the primary goals of Congress members. It's not meant to be cynical, but yes, Congress members need to get reelected in order to get things done, particularly in the House of Representatives, which is just a 2-year term. That's barely enough time to get started in today's world of complexity, of trying to get policy out there on the table and then get it deliberated and then get it passed. It takes a long time. So it's a job that they want to excel at, and in order to keep getting better at that job, you kind of have to get reelected. So therefore, a lot of their energy goes into getting reelected, which is unfortunate because that does distract from these other things that are very important, such as the policy making itself. They are the lawmaking branch, so they are responsible for passing the laws in our society. And even when they're not necessarily passing laws, they do have a lot of political influence on society because of the position that they're in, which is very visible, very prestigious, and that whenever they talk, people listen. Press is always wanting to hear what they say. So they do have considerable political influence, even when they're not making policy. Don't think there's a whole lot of argument that it's one of the most important jobs in our society because of the responsibility that they have for making the laws. The primary functions of Congress, as outlined in the Constitution, which we've already talked about, is that they provide the representation. The House of Representatives is proportional representation based on population, and with respect to the Senate, each state is represented with 2 senators. We'll look at that here in a second. Clearly, the legislation function of making the laws. The oversight and the advise and consent kind of go together somewhat. The Constitution says that the Congress must approve certain things, such as the bills. The Senate has the power to approve treaties, to approve appointments of the president. We've already talked about some of those basic things, so they literally would advise on that as well, and that also includes investigating it, oversight, questioning witnesses. They have the power to subpoena, keep an eye on the executive branch, as well as approve the appointments and the activities of the executive branch, and then, of course, the power to override the veto of the president of any bill. And then the power to impeach. The House has the power, according to the Constitution, to indict, make the charges, and then the trial is actually held in the Senate. Let's look at the House of Representatives. Have 435 members. There's 1 congressman per congressional district. We'll look at maps here in a minute. Each House of Representatives member is elected for a 2-year term. So that's one thing that a lot of people in America don't quite understand or take for granted, is that every 2 years we have a potentially completely different House of Representatives. So I said the membership per state varies by population. All the districts in the United States have, on average, about 760,000 people per district, and that keeps going up each 10 years because that's when the census is done, and then the reproportioning of these districts is done every 10 years. We'll talk about that here in a minute. The House, because they are representing a smaller territory in general, there are some states that have very small populations that only have 1 representative, but in general, the members tend to have fairly localized, reasonably more narrow constituencies because of who they're representing, and because it's a bigger chamber than the Senate and it's potentially more inexperienced in general, They have more rules to follow. They actually have a rules committee that outlines how much time that each member can spend on their presentation, and then how much time is spent with each rebuttal. So it's very highly controlled. The Speaker of the House has a lot of power on controlling that chamber because it's big and relatively less experienced than the Senate, more organized, more centralized authority with a rules committee that establishes those guidelines on their debate in the chamber. Now we'll look at the U.S. map in a minute, but this is the U.S. congressional districts of New Jersey, which after the 2020 census, it shifted a little bit. We got 12 congressional districts in New Jersey. Each one of those congressional districts has one representative that goes to the House in Washington, D.C. This is the 5th congressional district up here at the top of New Jersey. Look at that one because that's where a lot of Bergen County is there, as well as Bergen Community College right here in this area right there. So that's the close-up of the New Jersey's 5th congressional district there. These are the current members of the New Jersey delegation in the House of Representatives. I actually used to live in the 9th congressional district, and then it got reorganized a little bit in the 2020 census. Bill Pascarell of the 9th district was my representative prior to that. Now in the 5th congressional district, Josh Gottheimer, you'll see over here, there's 9 Democrats and 3 Republicans that make up the New Jersey coalition there of the House of Representatives. This is the U.S. map. It's a result of the 2022 midterm elections. Republicans took control by a fairly slim majority there of the House of Representatives. That was somewhat expected, which quite often happens in the midterm election right after a new president is elected. These are just some of the social psychological dynamics that tend to occur. They did not win as big a majority as they were expecting, but majority nonetheless. And the red districts, as you can see, Wyoming is one district because it's got a very small population. So the state of Wyoming is one congressional district, and you've got one House of Representatives member coming out of there. But as you can see, there's lots of little delineations here that are breaking down the various districts, all 435 of them in the United States. Alaska, very small population, one whole district. Now you can see a lot of red territory here, and this is part of the rural versus urban divide. We know that rural and small town areas typically tend to be somewhat more conservative in general. And then the urban areas tend to be a little bit more liberal in general. And that kind of plays out, as you can see with these populated regions here. You've got bigger populations, obviously, in these bluer areas. And so that's why the popular vote, for example, tends to lean more towards the Democrats, despite the fact that there's not near as much blue territory in this map. Well, that's because the blue territory tends to have higher concentrations of populations. Texas actually bears that out pretty well. Texas is a firmly red state, but when you look at the urban areas in Texas, for example, San Antonio and Austin going blue, Houston going blue, Dallas, Fort Worth region there going blue. So that kind of plays out that rural versus urban divide somewhat that's been studied and will be studied for a while, because that's kind of leading somewhat to our polarization in Congress, where it's very difficult for them to get things done because of that growing divide between the Republican and the Democratic Party. Looking at the senators, we've got 100 senators. There's 2 per state, 50 states. They are the higher, or the so-called the upper house, because they're given a little bit more power, and they actually have a longer term. They are elected for a 6-year term. but those elections are staggered so that the entire Senate is not up for re-election at one time. So every 2 years, 1/3 of the Senate is up for re-election. So that's how they stagger it. And this was a big concern. I've already mentioned this in the lecture on the Constitution. The biggest stumbling block during the Constitutional Convention was this equal representation of the small states. The small states felt like they were just going to get left out or swallowed up if they didn't have equal representation. And so therefore, to get over that hump, they decided to give every state equal representation, 2 senators in the Senate. And that's created some problems over the years that we've had to kind of deal with and live with. But that got them over the hump, at least to get a constitution. So that's one of the, sacrifices that are made in the effort to get things progressing in a generally positive direction, because I don't think there's any argument that the Constitution is one of the most important documents in human history, not just American history. Now, the Senate, because it's a smaller body and they are elected for a longer term, they have a little bit more prestige, a little bit more responsibility. They have broader, more diverse constituencies. They're representing the entire state rather than a district. And so therefore, they have a little bit more freedom to do what they feel like they need to do. And that's also potentially been problematic as well, because it can drag out longer in the Senate. They're less organized, more individualistic. They can spend a lot more time on debate, or even more importantly, of dragging out the debate or blocking legislation. One of the things that the Senate gave to itself back in the late 1800s was the filibuster. This was to give the minority party a little bit more leverage to keep from getting steamrolled, because in the late 1800s, the Republican Party dominated Congress for almost 50 years. Because coming out of the Civil War, the Democrats were hit really hard because of being the party of slavery, for the most part. And they decided this filibuster would allow the minority party to require a 3/5 vote, which would be 60 votes rather than a majority, 51 votes, in order to proceed. Because if they felt like that they were being steamrolled by policy that they really had no input in, they could invoke this 60 vote proposal. And it was used reasonably over the years until just in the last 15 years or so. It's been used enormously, a lot more as a political weapon. So we'll look at that here in a little bit later. Now, this is a map showing the 2022 midterm elections, where the Democrats managed to maintain a slight majority. That's the main numbers here, because this shows what states had elections. You can actually go to the U.S. Senate website and click on a state, and it'll tell you the senators there. The bottom line is that the states are getting more and more divided along red versus blue lines, and there's only 5 states in the United States that have split parties on their senators, where they have 1 Democrat and 1 Republican senator. Most states are either both Democrat or both Republican. So that is kind of showing you some of that polarization could be intensifying a bit. The 118th Congress is a little bit more diversified than previous. This is something that, society evolves and progresses a little bit in their diversity. So you can see in the House, a little bit more diversity. There you've got 53 black members out of the total members there, 46 Hispanic. In the Senate, not quite as diversified. It's always been very white male dominated, so you can see it's still pretty much that as well. Speaking of women, though, the 2018 midterm election was one of the most productive in history, as far as you can see right here, putting more women in Congress. We have about 1/4 of Congress is now made up of women. which is still quite a bit behind considering women make up 50% of the population. But as you can see, made a pretty big stride there in the 2018 election. Got a little bit more awareness of the midterm elections, more women running, a part of this progression of our system there. Now, Congress, because of that polarization, the two-party divide, gets a lot of criticism. Lots of political cartoonists got lots of ammunition to make critical political cartoons as a result of Congress's lack of productivity, comparatively speaking, from what they used to do in the past. So there's lots of jokes that can be had out there at their expense because of the difficulty of getting things done when you have this increasing two-party polarization, this increasingly dividing Congress. And as a result, their congressional job approval is historically low. Beginning in the early 2000s, now, clearly this is part of that rally around the flag effect that we talked about before, because after 9/11, there was a lot of confidence in government going out there and taking care of terrorism, and there's a lot of solidarity behind government. We were unified briefly because of the terrorism, and then it started to drop very quickly, and it's fluctuated a little bit, but still at around 20 to 22% is the approval rating of the Congress of our United States that's responsible for making the laws. So with a 20% approval rating, then that would bring up a question. Considering these very dismal approval ratings, comparatively speaking, what is the typical probability that a congressman will get reelected? And then the intuitive answer would be, well, I guess probably not very good, right? Unfortunately, it's just the opposite. Both houses have over a 90% possibility of getting reelected. It's higher in the House of Representatives, over 90% as far as the probability of getting reelected. In the Senate, right at about 90%. And you can see there is a chart on page 146, a line graph that shows that possibility, the high probability of getting reelected. So then you have to ask yourself, well, what's wrong with this picture? Why is it that the American people have such a low opinion, a very low approval rating of Congress, but yet they reelect them at a 90% rate? That just doesn't really make a whole lot of sense, does it? Well, that's why we would have to look at the power of the incumbent. The person that's already in office has lots of advantages to going ahead and getting reelected. Plus the fact the turnout is considerably lower in midterm elections. The big force, of course, is name recognition. Once you're already in office, people already are aware of your name. You get on TV, you get asked lots of questions, you've got that political influence. So therefore, right off the bat, because of the fact that people know your name, it's incredible how powerful that is, just that name recognition. Even when you look at advertising, once a commercial hits somebody's brain and they see that name, very powerful. That's going to give them an advantage over other products. Same thing is happening here. Everybody in general has heard that name and is going to just go to that name that they've already heard when they go to the polls, if they even go to the polls at all. They also have a huge advantage on fundraising because once they're in office, there's going to be a lot of funds that can be raised just because people recognize that, well, you're already in office, so you can help me, so we're going to contribute to your campaign. And so that's going to give them an advantage to getting reelected because they are already raising considerably more funds and already have more funds than any challenger could possibly have even before they get started into the race. And there's also the fact that a lot of people will not even enter the race because they are so far behind on the fundraising. Now, unfortunately, money matters. Now, the person that's going to spend the most money does not necessarily guarantee that they're going to win the election. There's been lots of examples where that did not happen. But it does matter because the more money you have, the more of that campaigning you can do, the more advertising you can do, and that early money can scare off some potentially good challengers that may have a chance of winning an election, but they don't even enter because they're farther behind on that money. As I said, you've already got more media coverage while you're on the job. This is a fairly small influence, but it does matter because once you're in Congress, you have free mailing privileges. You don't have to pay postage. Now, in the age of the internet, this is not as big a deal as it used to be, but you have to consider that the people that vote the most are older people who are not on the internet as much. So to be able to send out a postcard or a mailer to thousands of people and not have to pay for that, that's another nice little advantage that the incumbent has. Also, the fact that the incumbent is providing casework to their constituents. They do spend some time at home. They answer phone calls. They go out and make visits to their constituents there, go to ribbon cutting ceremonies. They are visible. So therefore, what work they have done, that gives them an advantage over any challenger. And as congressmen, they can literally bring legislative projects to their district. They can insert certain types of projects in big bills in order this wheeling dealing that goes on in Congress. There could be a problematic element that's having a hard time for this piece of legislation to get passed. So they'll make deals amongst each other and says, well, if you add this little bridge project in my district, I'll go ahead and support yours here, and then we'll have a package that can get passed. When those projects come to the district, people are appreciative of that, and that adds to their name recognition. Now, of course, gerrymandering is something that has been controversial and been in the courts several times over the last 15 years or so. The state legislatures are tasked by Congress to determine their election systems, their election process. So every 10 years when we have a new census, they have to redraw those districts. And if there is a party that's in power at that time, they will draw those districts to their advantage so that they can stay in power. And this has been quite controversial, and that has contributed to a lot of cases where the majority party in that state can maximize their districts. And there's been many examples, but in 2012, the overall House Republicans in the entire House of Representatives, they maintained a 33-seat advantage in the House of Representatives, despite overall nationwide, they got 1.4 million fewer votes than the Democrats. So that shows you how effective this gerrymandering can be when you slice and dice these districts to where they can go down to the neighborhood and include this little neighborhood into a district in order to try to either maximize their number of district members that are going to get reelected and try to minimize the other parties. Now, lower voter turnout, as I've mentioned, contributes to the incumbents just keep getting reelected because the only people that are voting are the people that pay attention to politics, and that's the person that they already know. So the higher the turnout, the more likelihood you're going to get for some variety of people getting elected. Here's a case that ended up in the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court struck down the GOP drawn, the Republican Party drawn congressional map for North Carolina. This was the old map, and you can see some slight variations here that the new map that was drawn by delegates from the court, a bipartisan committee. So you can see the differences here. Some are fairly subtle, but differences nonetheless. And when the election was held, the old map would have given the Republicans 11 of the 14 districts if they had maintained that old map. So you can see the difference because the new map actually resulted in a 7-7 split between the parties because it was drawn by bipartisan committee. And so that shows you the advantages that you can get from gerrymandering, because by using that old map, clearly they would have had just in that one state, they would have had 4 more members in the House than they got. And this momentum of the incumbent is evident in many different ways. This is just one of several examples. A New York assemblyman, this is the New York state legislature, in his particular district, won the 2016 September 13th Republican primary with 60% of the vote, despite the fact that he was facing fraud charges at the time. And oh, by the way, he died 4 days before the election and still got 60% of the vote. So what does that tell you? It tells you that the incumbent has got an advantage before anything else. Congressional gridlock, we've already talked about several of these. The filibuster, which has been weaponized over the past decade or so, because during Franklin Roosevelt's 12-year term, where the Republican was in the minority party of the Senate invoked filibuster only 6 times in that entire 12-year period. And 2 of those times was to oppose anti-lynching laws. So that shows you how much it's being used now for reasons not for what it was intended. In the 113th Senate, in this 2-year period, the Republican minority used it 218 times within that 2-year period. So that clearly it's being used to block legislation by the minority party. And this goes either way, because once one party does it and then they get back in power, well, guess what? The other party's going to start using it as well, and then it just starts to become a back and forth. And that's part of the difficulties what we're having right now, is because it's rather than compromise, what we're seeing generally is that one party's trying to get back into power and stay in power without any input from the other party until the other party can critique them enough, filibuster them enough to make sure that nothing much gets done, and then they'll get back into power. And gerrymandering also serves to maintain the party control of that state, which then translate to the same party control of Congress. And there have been debates over this because there's bigger bills now, and that could be something worth looking at. The bills are bigger, so they put out fewer bills. But Congress, of those 112th, 113th sessions, were considered the least productive in modern history. And this is a chart here showing going from 89 to 20. You can see the gradual decrease in substantive legislation. Now, obviously, we have to take into account that the bills that they pass today are generally bigger than what they used to be, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're better. And trying to pass more smaller bills might actually be more productive, addressing one issue at a time, getting a bill out there rather than trying to cram everything into a big bill. So there's debates over that, but clearly not as productive as they used to be. And then here's the trend of cloture motions, which is what is invoked when they make the motion for a filibuster. So going back to the 70s, you had a fairly reasonable amount of filibuster attempts. It starts to rise a little bit as we get into the 2000s. And then starting about 15 years or so ago, it really jumped up, and then it became virtually just a political tool used by the minority party to block legislation of the majority party in order to try to discredit them, minimize their productivity as being in control of that house, and then hopefully turning public opinion back against them so that the minority party can get reelected back into power. And then the other party will do the same thing to them. So that's not very productive, and is certainly not the way it was designed. That was not the original intent by the framers that created the system. Now, the committees are the workhorses of public policy in our system. There's committees for many different issues. Now, this I need to update this page number here because the current edition of the book, this is on page 151, and it's got the list of the standing committees. You've got agricultural committees, armed services committees, foreign affairs committees, and these are in both houses. And they're, in some cases, they're named differently, but they're basically looking at the same issues in both houses. So you can see those list of standing committees, and that's where all the behind-the-scenes work gets, that's where all the nitty-gritty work gets done. The details are hammered out before they even bring it out into the open chamber. And the party that's in power determines the chairperson of that committee. So that's why getting that majority of that house is so important, because the majority party can call the shots, determine those chairpersons, and as a result, they have that very powerful gatekeeping function. Because if the party in power does not like that bill, it will not even get out of the committee, because that gatekeeping function is so vital. The chairperson is a member of that majority party, and they will direct him to not let that get out of committee unless the party is happy with it, or if it, obviously, it would have to favor the party in power for it to get out the door. So here are the steps for a proposal to become a law. First, the bill is introduced. It's generally introduced to the open house and then referred to a committee, and then that could also be referred back down to a subcommittee after that. And whatever the issue is, in fact, if it's a foreign policy issue, it might get put into the Foreign Affairs Committee, more than likely. It depends on the issue at hand. It could go into the Agriculture Committee, it could go in the Judiciary Committee, depending on what that bill is dealing with. So in this first step, that committee studies it. They bring in witnesses. That's where they have the power to subpoena, question people as to why this bill would be needed to be done this way, because they want to get expert witnesses in it. They're also dealing with lobbyists who have their own interests from other groups and corporations and other perhaps political organizations that are very interested in this bill. So the lobbyists are working with them to try to iron out the details of that bill. The bulk of this work is behind closed doors, and then the committee has the power to either recommend this bill to the open chamber, to the entire floor, or not. That's where that gatekeeping power comes into play. And this is where the vast majority of bills die. Most of them, the overwhelming majority of them, cannot get out of committee. That's why this first step is extremely important in order to get to bill to become a law, because it's got to get out of the committee first. Then it goes to the floor for debate. The House, as I said, has a rules committee which determines the time allotted for the debate and the number of potential floor amendments that could be made. The Senate is a little bit more open and less time constricted. The majority and minority leaders kind of get together and determine the schedule, but they can debate as long as they want. In fact, that was the first technique for filibusters, that somebody would get up there and just command the floor, and he would hold it indefinitely until they could finally vote to get rid of that person who was literally just stymieing the bill. And filibuster, as I said, is now quite common. It requires 60 votes to stop that and then proceed. If they can't get that 60 votes, that bill is done, because the minority party has stopped it from moving. The next step is that once they've all agreed on it with the floor, it might have to go back for revisions, might have amendments added to it, whatever. But the bottom line is once they get to a package that they agree on, then they pass it. Each house passes their version of the bill. Like I said, in the Senate, it may require 60 votes in order to overcome that filibuster. Normally, it's just a majority in either house, typically. But like I said, sometimes Senate requires a supermajority. And if it's something like a treaty, that requires a 2/3 majority if it's an international treaty. Now, the fourth step is that after both houses have passed their version of the bill, well, now we have two different versions of the same bill for all practical purposes. So now it has to go to that conference committee stage, those two different versions. Now there's going to be a lot of similarities between these bills because there's a lot of communication going on during this process, and it could take months, if not maybe even a year or more, to get something done on this. So there's obviously a lot of commonalities by the time it gets to the conference committee, but there's most likely going to be some major differences as well. So that conference committee, which is made up of members of both houses and both parties, they iron out those differences and present the final version that both houses are going to have to approve, because now the things that they're voting on are the same. They've melded those two bills together into one version, and that final version has to be approved by both houses, and that's pretty much their job is done. And then it's sent on to the White House, and that final approved version is signed by the president, and it becomes law. And that's where it's usually a really big deal. The president has the signing ceremony where he signs it numerous times with a pen and gives the pens to the major players or to the special guests to the signing ceremony. Congress, now obviously the president, if he does not agree with that bill, he can refuse to sign it. That does not happen very often. We looked at those numbers, not as much as it used to. And the veto can be overridden by 2/3 vote in both houses. So that has to be a very popular bill in order for that to happen, because both houses are quite polarized. Very difficult to get a 2/3 vote on anything unless it's just a very popular, nonpartisan bill that the American people are, ready to receive and pat Congress on the back for getting something done. And so therefore, the both houses could certainly override that veto, and then it would become law. So I've condensed those into the 5 steps of getting a proposed bill into a law. And this is a condensed 5-step version from the chart on page 154, which gives a lot more detailed flow chart. But as far as what I might ask you on the test, you can look at these 5 basic steps right here, and that will be plenty enough to understand how that works. Now, one final thing I want to talk about is 3 primary groups of citizens in America that influence policymaking. We're talking about the constituents. Those are the people that live in those districts and live in those states that vote. Well, not all of them, but a good portion of them vote on the congressman. And then the interest groups, which have an enormous amount of influence. We're going to talk an entire chapter just about interest groups, and they have the most influence. And of course, the parties themselves, which have considerable amount of influence on the interior workings, a lot of which we've already talked about, how that works with the party divide. But now, as far as constituents go, they typically, this is kind of ironic, but the constituents, the voters, typically have less influence on the policy making. Now, again, we're not talking about getting reelected. We're talking about making policy. Who has the most influence on the policy that these congressmen are tasked to put out? Well, typically the constituents have quite a bit less for several reasons. The public is typically uninformed on policy. They may have a rational ignorance. They may be smart enough to understand it, but they don't have time. They're busy, got lots of stuff to do. They got jobs. They're working overtime. They come home. The wife wants them to fix the whatever. And so therefore, through rational ignorance, they are pretty much just delegating the congressman to do that. So the congressmen don't necessarily pay a whole lot of attention to what the constituents are. They're elected based on the platform, so they kind of know what direction of policy that they're going to do anyway. The attentive public is very small. Like I said, most people don't even vote, and a very smaller percentage of them even pay attention to policy. So therefore, because they're elected by that group, on a certain party platform, they anticipate their policy views. So constituents, not a whole lot of influence. Interest groups, however, a lot of influence. These are the organized benefit seekers that we're going to be talking about in considerably more detail later on. These are the corporations, the professional associations, the special interest groups, such as the NRA and the AARP and the NAACP. There's lots of acronyms out there of groups of people that are coming together to create a benefit for themselves. They pool their resources, raise a lot of money, hire lobbyists, contribute to campaign reelection in order to get the attention of the policymakers. And then the lobbyists actually work with the congressman in order to help get that policy crafted out the door. I already alluded to that. So they're able to gather members, power in numbers, more resources, more money, fundraising capacity, political action committees that are specifically designed to raise money from the members, particularly corporations. If you work for a corporation, they can actually take that PAC donation right out of your paycheck, and they use that money to contribute to various lawmakers in order to try to get benefits for that group. And that's kind of what greases the wheel. That's what really sparks action by Congress. The interest groups are the primary drivers of public policy in this pluralist system that we have. We'll talk about that in more detail later on, but for now, we know that interest groups are the biggest drivers, most important. They put pressure on Congress. That's why they're called pressure groups. They're seeking those benefits, so they work with the congressman to help congressmen pass that policy in order to get those benefits. They also provide that expertise that the congressman might not have, and they've got resources that they can give them loads of information to help them with the crafting of that legislation. Very important driver of policy, and the interest groups get benefits back as a result from that. Now, the party has a lot of influence within the interior of these chambers. The biggest driver is the fact that people are elected on that party platform, and if they want to remain as part of that coalition and want to keep getting reelected, they have to demonstrate a certain amount of discipline and loyalty towards the party. And that has to happen in order to get that majority rule, which is the most important thing that a party is striving for. They're not going to get that majority unless all of their members are disciplined and very loyal to the party, so that they stick to that party line and maintain that majority rule. Because even if you have a majority of the members of that chamber, if all of those members don't vote together in block, your majority is useless. So therefore, they have to get that majority. That requires a very concentrated effort by all the members of the party, and then they have to maintain that discipline and loyalty to that party so that they can get that majority and use that majority with their committee assignments. The people in the majority party get the choice assignments. The chairman of every committee is a member of that majority party, and he has to have that loyalty to the party to keep that gatekeeping power, which is really the spigot as to how that bill is actually going to get out the door to the chamber floor. They also have a whip system that corrals the members into making sure that they're all voting in block. Information gets passed out to all the members through this whip system. The second most important person in each party is what they call the party whip. He's the one that goes out and sends out the messages and keeps everybody together in line, make sure that all these deals are made so that everybody is voting in block for that party so that that bill can get passed as to what that party wants. So the whip is the one that's corralling those types of things. And then in the midst of that, they are log rolling, which is just a slang term for making deals with each other to get mutual support for that bill in order to maintain that majority to get that bill passed as to what that party wants. So Within the chamber, party has considerable amount of influence on policymaking, quite obviously. Okay, so that wraps up our video lecture for Chapter 5 on Congress. Stay tuned for discussion forum.